They said she was born during a storm, when the thunder cracked like war drums and the wind refused to bow. No one in the territory had ever seen her cry, and none dared look her in the eye for too long. She was known only as the bride of the Apache war chief, a woman draped in silence and mystery, with a gaze that felt older than the mountains. Stories whispered that she could summon spirits, call coyotes by name, and stop a man's heart with a single word. But to the cowboy who crossed in her world that night, she was something far more dangerous. She was an answer he didn't know he was asking for. He hadn't meant to enter the tent. Not really. The fire had died down, the war drums had gone quiet, and curiosity had gotten the better of his fear. He was no stranger to danger. He'd faced gunfire, outlaws, and drought. But nothing had prepared him for what waited behind that curtain of deer hide. Inside, the air was thick with cedar smoke and silence. She sat alone, back straight, eyes closed. And when she opened them, the world shifted. It wasn't a stare, it was a revelation. No words passed between them at first. He stepped forward, drawn like a moth to something older than flame. Her voice, when it came, wasn't loud, but it carried, not through his ears, but through his blood. She didn't speak English. She didn't need to. Her presence said everything. That night, the cowboy saw a side of the West he'd never been taught, something sacred, untamed, and burning with the kind of power no bullet could touch. By dawn, the tribe was no longer asleep. They stood, row after row, shoulder to shoulder, watching as the woman emerged from the tent with the cowboy behind her. She raised her hand, not as a greeting, not as a threat, but as a command. And what happened next would be told for generations. 300 warriors, hardened by battle and years of blood, fell to one knee in unison. Not because they were forced, but because they chose to honor the power she had just revealed. And the cowboy, he never left. Not because he was held, but because he had finally found something worth surrendering to. In a land ruled by dust and death, he had stumbled into a story too sacred to write, too powerful to forget. And it all began the moment he stepped into the tent of the Apache bride. The cowboy's name was Silas Crane. A drifter by trade, he'd ridden from the edge of Missouri to the desert borders of New Mexico with nothing but a weathered rifle, a scar across his cheek, and the kind of silence only carried by men who'd buried too much. He wasn't looking for salvation. Men like him had stopped believing in that long ago. But fate doesn't ask what you believe. It just waits. And when he wandered into the Apache camp at the edge of the Sierra Madre, fate was already watching. He had earned their tolerance, not their trust. A favor returned here, a danger warned there. Slowly, the warriors learned he wasn't there to steal, to spy, or to tame what wasn't his. Still, the camp had boundaries, lines that no outsider crossed. And the tent of the bride? That was the heart of their circle. Sacred, untouchable. Except that night, the wind had shifted, and the fire seemed to lean in his direction. Something unseen guided his boots forward, toward that flap of hide, swaying like an invitation. Inside, time bent. The sense of crushed herbs, burning sage, and warm earth filled his lungs. She didn't flinch when he entered, didn't reach for a blade. She simply looked at him, with eyes like obsidian, dark, still, and reflecting everything he tried to bury. Her name was Alawa, which meant peaceful one, though nothing about her felt soft. Her stillness was like a blade in its sheath, silent, but not safe. And yet, Silas didn't turn back. Something in him knew the ground had already shifted beneath his feet. She motioned for him to sit, and he obeyed without understanding why. Alawa began to chant, not in words meant for men, but in tones that vibrated through his chest. He saw flashes behind his eyes, battles he never spoke of, the grave of a brother lost to a border war, the shadow of a woman he failed to save. Tears welled unbidden, not from pain, but recognition. She was showing him himself, not as a drifter, but as a soul still tethered to meaning he'd forgotten. And then came the stillness. Total, complete, the kind of silence that humbles storms. When he opened his eyes, Alawa was standing, her hand pressed against the center of his chest. "Your spirit is not lost," she whispered, in English so soft it sounded like wind across water. It was only hiding. In that moment, Silas knew he hadn't entered her tent by mistake. He had crossed a threshold meant to change him. And outside, Without knowing why, the warriors began to gather. They came in silence, row upon row of Apache warriors, summoned not by horn or drum, but by something older, presence. The fire burned brighter than before, casting long shadows that danced along the canyon walls. Alawa stepped outside the tent first, her face painted not for battle, but for truth. She held in her hand a staff wrapped in deer hide and turquoise, etched with markings no settler could read. Behind her, Silas emerged, not as a trespasser, but as someone reborn through understanding. What happened next would burn itself into the memories of everyone present. Alawa raised her staff to the sky, and without a word, every warrior, young, old, hardened by raids and loss, fell to one knee. 300 in total. Silas didn't breathe. He thought it might be some sort of ritual, something symbolic. But when Alawa looked over her shoulder and met his eyes, he realized the truth. It wasn't a ceremony. It was a revelation. They weren't kneeling to her bloodline or her title. They were kneeling to the power she had just awakened. The Apache believed deeply in vision, spiritual inheritance passed not through names, but through revelation. Alawa had never claimed to be a seer. She had never claimed anything. But that night, under the weight of stars and silence, the tribe saw her not just as a bride, but as a voice for the ancestors. She had revealed something sacred within Silas, and in doing so, revealed something divine within herself. It was a moment that tore down walls the West had spent generations building. Silas stood frozen. He had faced revolvers at close range, watched friends die in ambushes, survived stampedes and betrayals. But nothing had ever left him more humbled than that moment. The pride he once clung to like a weapon had melted into something quieter, reverence. He wasn't just a cowboy anymore. He was a witness to something holy, and deep in his bones, he knew this was a story he could never speak of without cheapening it. As dawn broke and the fire dimmed, Alawa turned to him and said, "The land has chosen you to remember." No ceremony followed, no feast, just those words. And then, like smoke, the crowd dispersed, leaving only footprints and silence. Silas remained by the ashes, heart pounding, unable to move, not because he was lost, but because for the first time in years, he was finally home. In the days that followed, the camp changed, though no one said it aloud. Warriors who once passed Silas with narrowed eyes now nodded with quiet acknowledgement. Children followed him at a distance, curious about the man who had entered the sacred tent and walked out unburned. And Alawa, she did not retreat. She moved through the camp with a presence that felt larger than flesh, and wherever she walked, silence followed, not out of fear, but awe. Silas began to see the land through different eyes. The rocks held stories, the wind a voice, the animals a rhythm. Each morning, Alawa taught him something new, not with instructions, but with moments. How to track time by the sky's breath, how to sense danger by the stillness of birds, how to offer thanks to the river before drawing water. These lessons weren't spoken, they were lived. And slowly, Silas found himself less cowboy and more something else, something grounded. At night, they sat by the fire, not as warrior and foreigner, but as soul and soul. Alawa never asked about his past, and Silas never forced questions about hers. Their silence was the kind that healed, layer by layer. One evening, she handed him a strip of hide etched with symbols. "This is your name now," she said. He traced the markings with his calloused fingers. They meant walks between, a name given not in jest, but in recognition of a man who had entered two worlds and chosen to carry both. But peace does not last long in the West, not when men are greedy and guns are cheap. Word had spread beyond the canyons. A cowboy had entered the Apache camp and come out marked. A white man had walked into the tent of the chief's bride and lived. In saloons and army forts, the story twisted like a rattlesnake in dust. Some claimed he'd been cursed. Others said he now controlled the tribe. All of them were wrong, but none of them cared about truth. One morning, a scout returned with news. A militia was coming. Not for peace, not for talk. They were bringing rifles, fear, and a flag that had always meant conquest. Silas listened without blinking. He'd seen this before. Towns burned because someone couldn't understand what they didn't own. But this time, he wouldn't run. This time, he wasn't just a cowboy caught in someone else's storm. He was part of something worth protecting. And for the first time in his life, he had something to stand for. The tribe prepared in silence. No panic, no frenzy, just movement guided by knowing. Elders walked among the children, whispering songs that had once kept them safe in darker times. The warriors checked their arrows and painted their faces, not for blood, but for truth. This wasn't a battle they sought. It was one that had arrived, unwelcome and uninvited. And Silas, now marked by their trust, knew he couldn't stand behind the fire. He had to stand in front of it. He approached the war chief at dawn. The man's face was carved from stone, eyes unreadable. Silas offered his saddle rifle, the same one that had saved his life more times than he could count. "I ride with you," he said. The chief studied him for a long moment, then placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded once. That was enough. In the West, words were cheap. Loyalty wasn't. As the sun rose, Alawa appeared beside Silas. Her war paint was different. White streaks across her cheeks, a blue line down her chin. She looked both sacred and terrifying. In her hand, she held a bundle of sage and something wrapped in cloth. She pressed it to his chest. Inside, a carved eagle feather, blackened at the tip. "This is not for power," she said. "It is for remembering who you are when the world tries to make you forget." By the time the militia appeared on the ridgeline, the tribe was ready, but they were not afraid. Silas stood at the front, rifle lowered, eyes locked on the men who had come to erase something they didn't understand. The tension in the air was thick, but beneath it, something stronger pulsed: unity. The tribe did not stand behind Silas. They stood beside him, as equals, as one. The officer raised his hand, preparing to give the order. Silas stepped forward, alone. Every breath, every scar, every step he had taken led to this moment. He did not raise his rifle. He raised the feather Alawa had given him. And in the vast silence between heartbeats, something changed. Not in the militia, not in the tribe, but in the land itself. The wind shifted. The earth held its breath. And somewhere deep in the bones of the West, a new story was being born. The officer hesitated. For a heartbeat, his hand remained raised, suspended in that fragile space between command and conscience. He'd come to the ridge expecting resistance, expecting violence. But what he saw instead was a cowboy holding a sacred feather, backed not by rage, but by a wall of quiet conviction. These weren't rebels. They weren't invaders. They were protectors of land, of spirit, of memory. And Silas, the outsider, stood not as their leader, but as their equal. Behind the officer, younger soldiers shifted uneasily. They had heard stories about the Apache, the same half-truths and twisted tales that filled every army barrack and saloon. But what they saw now contradicted everything. Children stood with their mothers, warriors beside elders, and not a single face carried fear. The only expression they wore was that of defiance wrapped in dignity. For the first time, some of those soldiers questioned the rifles in their hands. Silas took a step forward. Not fast, not bold, just certain. He spoke, not with volume, but with clarity. "If you've come to destroy what you don't understand," he said, "then you're not here for justice. You're here for erasure, and I won't let you." His voice didn't shake, because it wasn't just his voice anymore. It carried the weight of every step he had taken since entering Alawa's tent. Every lesson, every silence, every truth. The officer lowered his hand, not in surrender, but in something deeper: recognition. Maybe he saw in Silas a version of himself that had been lost to orders and uniform. Maybe he understood that power, real power, wasn't about who shouted loudest or held the most bullets. It was about who stood still when the world tried to make them kneel. He turned his horse without a word, and one by one, the rest followed him down the ridge, leaving behind only dust and disbelief. When the last hoofbeat faded, the tribe didn't cheer. They didn't raise their weapons or sing songs of victory. They simply breathed. Alawa stepped forward, her eyes on Silas. In that silence, everything was said. He hadn't just defended the tribe. He had honored it. He had remembered. And in doing so, he had rewritten the fate that once marked him as a wanderer. He was no longer a man between two worlds. He had become the bridge itself. In the days after the standoff, The camp returned to its rhythm, but not unchanged. There was a stillness in the mornings now, a reverence in the way fires were lit and water drawn. Children played closer to the center, where Alawa often sat weaving, her hands patient and steady. And Silas, he remained at her side, not as a protector, not as a symbol, but as someone who had finally laid down the weight he'd carried since boyhood. He began carving again, a skill long buried beneath years of wandering. Small things, feathers, birds, the gentle curve of a mountain under moonlight. Warriors brought him branches, knowing he'd give them back as something sacred. He didn't carve for glory. He carved for remembrance. Each piece held a moment, a fire shared, a silence endured, a lesson earned. They called him Walker Between, not as a title, but as a truth. Alawa watched him with quiet pride. She never tried to shape him. She never needed to. She had simply held up a mirror the night he entered her tent and waited for him to see himself clearly. And now, as the sun dipped behind the canyon walls each night, they sat side by side, not speaking of destiny or fate, but of roots, of how sometimes it's not the land you seek, but the people who teach you to stand still upon it. Rumors drifted in from nearby towns. The cowboy who made 300 kneel. The woman who commands the wind. They arrived, twisted, exaggerated, blurred by distance and fear. But the truth? The truth remained here, beneath the cottonwoods and along the riverbeds. It remained in the hands of children who carved feathers into stones, and in the way Silas touched the earth before every meal. The truth didn't need to be loud. It just needed to endure. And it did. Because the power Alawa revealed that night wasn't one of domination. It was one of memory, of connection, of transformation. She hadn't asked anyone to kneel. They had chosen to. Because in her presence, they saw something ancient rise up through a modern world that had tried so hard to forget. And through Silas, that memory had found its voice again. Seasons passed, but the story never faded. The camp remained untouched, a sacred pocket of resistance wrapped in silence and guarded by the rhythm of tradition. Silas grew into his place, not as a leader, not as a symbol, but as a thread in a much older fabric. He no longer questioned where he belonged. The land had spoken, and he had answered. And Alawa, ever composed, watched as his soul settled into the dust like roots into soil. There were days when strangers would come, wanderers, traders, even soldiers without flags. Some came seeking answers. Others came hoping to witness what had only been spoken in hushed taverns or scribbled into journals. They all came with one thing in common: disbelief. And each time, they left with something else entirely, something they couldn't explain, something they didn't dare speak of. Because what they saw was not magic. It was memory alive and breathing. One traveler, a rider from the east, once asked Silas how he'd come to hold such power. Silas simply handed him a carved eagle feather and said, "It's not mine to hold. I only carry it until the next one's ready." That was the way of the West. Not to possess, but to pass on. And in a time where men measured strength in land and lead, Silas had become living proof that true power lived in humility, in reverence, and in knowing when to kneel. Alawa continued to walk between dreams and waking, between spirit and skin. At night, she sang songs no one dared to record, songs that moved the fire, songs that quieted grief. And beside her, Silas kept watch, not out of duty, but out of devotion. Their bond wasn't forged in passion or need. It was something far rarer: alignment. Two people who had found each other not by accident, but by ancestral design. As if the wind itself had drawn their paths like trails across canyon stone. One morning, under a blood-orange sky, Alawa traced her fingers across Silas's chest and whispered, "The next storm will come for what we've built." Silas nodded, not in fear, but in understanding. The world outside had not changed. But now, they were ready, not because of strength in numbers or sharpened weapons, but because the truth they carried was heavier than bullets. And some truths cannot be broken, only passed forward, one kneeling soul at a time. When the storm finally came, it wasn't fire or fist that led it, but ink and law. Surveyors arrived with papers and pens, maps redrawn without consent. They claimed the land was federal, that treaties had expired, that silence meant surrender. But the tribe knew better, and Silas, standing in front of them once more, held out the feather, not in defiance, but in testimony. This place, he told them, was never yours to take. They laughed at him, called him a fool, threatened him with cords and chains. But Alawa stood beside him, dressed in white and turquoise, face unpainted. Let them write what they want, she whispered. We write in stone. And so they did. With every sunrise, they marked the cliffs with symbols. With every step, they carved stories into paths. With every song, they turned air into memory. The West had tried to erase people like them for centuries. But ink fades. Stone remains. The surveyors left with empty hands and sour words. But their footprints, even as they vanished, had left an echo. And the tribe, knowing how fragile peace could be, began preparing not for battle, but for legacy. They started building not just for themselves, but for those yet to come. And Silas, now older, began teaching. Not how to shoot, but how to see, how to listen, how to carry a feather without needing to explain it. Children gathered around him as he carved, asking questions about why the sky changed when Alawa sang, or how a man from the outside came to feel more rooted than the trees. And Silas would smile, place a hand on their shoulder, and say, because sometimes the land finds you before you find yourself. And they would sit in silence, as children of the West were taught to do, letting the wind finish what words could not. By now, few remembered the exact moment when 300 had knelt. But the feeling of that night still lingered in the stones, in the fire, in the bones of those who had witnessed it. And as long as Silas and Alawa walked side by side, truth had a body, and legacy had a voice. The kind of voice that didn't shout. It whispered, but it never forgot. Years passed like migrating shadows, slow, deliberate, and unstoppable. Silas's hair turned to ash, and his hands, once calloused from reins and rifles, grew slower but more precise with each carving. He no longer rode far. He didn't need to. The world had begun to come to him. Young men seeking meaning, women with burdens too heavy for prayer, soldiers tired of orders. All came not for miracles, but for remembering. And Silas offered them the same thing Alawa had once given him, stillness. Alawa remained ageless in the eyes of many. Her steps never lost their grace, and her voice never cracked under time's weight. Yet even she knew that sacred things must pass through many hands to survive. One night, she placed the original eagle feather, the same one she had given Silas all those years ago, into the fire. It did not burn. It rose, carried by a wind that came from nowhere. The children gasped. The warriors watched in silence. And Silas closed his eyes, knowing the story was ready to be reborn. Not long after, a young girl named Wea began to dream of voices in the wind and faces in the stone. She carved with the precision of someone far older than her years. She listened more than she spoke. Alawa watched her closely. Silas taught her with the patience only those near the end can truly offer. And when the time came, it wasn't announced. It simply was. Wea stood before the fire one night and sang a song no one had heard in generations. And the fire, once small, rose to meet her voice. Silas stood beside her then, hand on her shoulder, eyes filled not with sadness, but with fullness. She's ready, he whispered. Alawa nodded. The tribe gathered not for ceremony, but for acknowledgement. The story had chosen its next bearer. And Silas, who had once wandered broken across deserts and saloons, now stood with pride, not as a father, but as a witness to legacy. Because in the Old West, the greatest mark you could leave wasn't carved in stone, it was planted in hearts. That night, under a sky more stars than dark, Silas sat beside Alawa, their hands clasped, their silence shared. When I first entered your tent, he said softly, I thought I was walking into a mystery. She turned to him, eyes gleaming in the firelight. You were, she answered. But now, you are the keeper of it. And so he was. Not by force, not by destiny, but by choice. The same choice he made the moment he stayed and never looked back. When Silas's time came, it came as gently as dusk. No violence, no pain, just the quiet retreat of breath beneath a red sky. He lay beneath the cottonwoods, the feathered talisman resting over his chest, his fingers curled around the first carving he'd ever made, an eagle in flight. Alawa sat beside him until the last breeze passed through his silver hair. No tears, just a long silence, broken only by the rhythm of drums that seemed to rise from the earth itself. He was buried beneath the stones, where the wind speaks only to those who listen. Not under a cross, not beneath a name, but beside a carving etched into the canyon wall, Walker between. That was enough, because Silas Crane didn't need a monument. His monument was the story itself, still carried in the hands of children, still whispered beside firelight, still sung beneath stars that remembered his silence more than his words. Weah continued his work, shaping wood and story alike. She traveled to distant villages, leaving carvings behind where words couldn't reach. And wherever she went, she told of the cowboy who walked into an Apache bride's tent and found not a woman, but a truth too ancient for books. A truth that made warriors kneel and ghosts rise. And she always ended the story the same way. He didn't become one of us. He helped us become more of who we already were. Alawa grew old, but never fragile. She remained the firekeeper, the memory holder, the guardian of the tent that had once shifted the course of a man's life. And sometimes, when the wind moved just right, she'd swear she felt Silas's hand brush hers. Not in goodbye, but in reminder that stories, once truly lived, never end. They just echoed differently. And so the tale of the cowboy and the bride lived on, not as legend, not as myth, but as a heartbeat beneath the dust. In a land where the West tried to forget, they remembered. And every time the fire crackled and a child leaned in to listen, the story burned brighter. Because in the Old West, power wasn't taken. It was revealed to those who had the courage to kneel. In a world that often glorifies noise, Silas Crane chose silence. Not the silence of absence, but the sacred stillness that listens, learns, and remembers. His journey began with a step into the unknown, a single moment of curiosity that opened the door to something eternal. He didn't come seeking power. He didn't demand respect. Yet he left behind a story that even the wind chose to carry. And perhaps that is the truest kind of strength, the kind that doesn't force others to follow, but quietly teaches them how to stand. The power Alawa revealed that night wasn't rooted in dominance. It was born from understanding. She didn't command 300 warriors to kneel. She simply showed them something ancient, something that couldn't be explained, only felt. And they knelt not for her, but for the truth she had awakened in all of them. That truth lived on through Silas, through Weah, through every soul who stopped running and started remembering. The legacy they built wasn't one of walls or weapons. It was one of memory, of moments passed hand to hand, fire to fire. And in the Old West, where so many stories were erased by steel and conquest, this one survived not because it shouted, but because it knew how to whisper across generations. It reminds us that transformation doesn't always look like battle. Sometimes it looks like listening, like choosing to stay, like kneeling when the world expects you to rise. So, if this story stirred something in you, if it made you question the weight of your own steps or the way you carry your past, don't let it end here. Stories like this aren't meant to be watched and forgotten. They're meant to live in those who hear them, meant to be shared, carried, remembered, because maybe, just maybe, you are also standing at the edge of your own tent with a choice that could change everything. If this journey moved you, let the fire keep burning. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your thoughts below. Not just to support, but to add your voice to a legacy that refuses to fade. Every story remembered becomes a light in the dark. Let yours be one of them.